across beds, hearts and bucks.
This is The Health Show.
BBC Three Counties Radio.
Good afternoon, you're listening to The Health Show with me, Sophie Sulehria, standing in this afternoon for Nana Akweer. Coming up on today's show, after more than 40 years, an inquiry will look at how almost 3,000 people died after receiving contaminated blood. It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, and I'll be speaking to someone who was affected. You're listening to The Health Show with me, Sophie Sulehria, standing in for Nana Akweer this Sunday afternoon. Coming up, I'll be meeting the man from Letchworth who almost died after receiving contaminated blood.
This is The Health Show
on BBC Three Counties Radio.
Now, after more than 40 years, an inquiry is to start looking at how almost 3,000 people died after receiving contaminated blood. Thousands of NHS patients were given the blood products from abroad that were infected with hepatitis C and HIV. It's since been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Mark is from Letchworth and he himself received contaminated blood. Mark, thank you for joining me this afternoon.
You're welcome. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you too. Mark, why did you receive this blood in the first place? Can you tell me?
Yes, well, I was actually born with what's quite a rare genetic blood disorder called haemophilia. But my version is the most severe. So the way that is treated is they used to take a pint of blood. They would then make it they would put it through a process to break it down into the various different components, and then they would draw off the clotting element, which is known as factor VIII. That's the protein that my body doesn't produce.
So at the time you needed a blood transfusion, is that right?
No. This is the area where people do tend to get confused.
Okay.
People who say somebody who had an accident or surgery, they would be given a pint of blood. You picture the bag of blood above the bed. With us, what they did with the factor VIII, the really filthy, mucky stuff, they would take thousands and thousands and thousands of pints of blood, put it all into big vats, and then, as I said, they put it through a process called fractionation, and that breaks it all down, and they draw off the factor VIII. They then would freeze dry it, so you had a bottle. But because it was made from up to 60,000 donations, we're talking about, so if any of those pints of blood had been taken from somebody who had illnesses like HIV, hepatitis, and then that would be used for haemophiliacs.
Mark, when were you given this blood? How old were you?
I was 3 years old. It was just after it was on my third birthday that I was diagnosed with severe haemophilia. Oh. So from there on, the treatment of cryoprecipitate started. And as a severe haemophiliac, can you imagine a 3-year-old toddler? So you're banging into things and you fall over, and obviously walking and as babies do. So you would. My parents. The thing that makes this quite sad is that because of haemophilia, especially even now, that when people see the bruises, they immediately just think that I was being knocked about and being abused. So there was always sort of, you could see people would look at Mum when she would have this baby with bruises all down his legs. So that was from 3 years old. And then in 1977, that's when, in the middle of the night, I'd been taken to hospital, Great Ormond Street, because I suffered from nosebleeds. And I mean, when these nosebleeds would start, they just didn't stop. So they would get me to the hospital as quickly as possible. And in the middle of the night, they gave me factor VIII, but they didn't tell my mum who was with me.
Right.
And it was only a few days later when my mum saw them making up the treatment, because I was there during the day. Mum questioned it and said, well, Mark has cryoprecipitate. And they said, oh, well, no, it was changed. But, oh, well, the change has happened, so there's no point in putting him back now.
So when did you find out, Mark, that this blood was bad, essentially, that you were diagnosed with HIV?
1984.
So that must have been indescribable, unimaginable time for you. How did it feel to find that out? How did your parents feel?
it was a subject that actually we've never really spoken much about, because we all just went into shock, and we all went our own ways, I think, with our thinking. Because you see, what led up to that diagnosis was I'd just spent 6 weeks in hospital, and now looking back through my medical notes, I was nothing more than a lab rat. They just had me as a piece of meat that they experimented on for 6 weeks. And it was as we were leaving the hospital, I was being released to go home. It was shouted across the waiting room by one of the haemophilia nurses, did my parents want to know my HIV results? They didn't know anything about it. They'd not been given consent. And the nurse just said, positive, see you next time.
That is an awful way to find out such life-changing news. It's shocking.
No counselling. No, are you okay? But the thing, Sophie, what makes this worse is that, like I said, they had me there for 6 weeks. At no point did they say to Mum and Dad, look, there is this danger in it, that it's coming from America. We're hearing about it. We are aware that there is a possibility Mark could be infected. Can we test? If they'd have done that, my parents obviously would have said, do it. But they didn't. It was just done non-consensually because they wanted to find out what they could. As I'd had the knee surgery, they had access to blood, bone, tissue samples, you name it. I was there in a bed for 6 weeks. So they basically, as I said, they used me. And that actually breaches the Nuremberg Code, because any kind of research that is non-consensual, you're meant to get consent.
Now, Mark, you've lived with this trauma for most of your life. How have you come to terms with that?
I think that I've been to some very dark places, because I've been told a number of times, this is it, I'm going to die.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I don't think you do quite get your head around it. It's only now that I've thankfully got older. I mean, I'm touching on the door of 50. They told me I wouldn't live long enough to leave school, and I'm nearly 50. But the thing that I've noticed now, I do get flashbacks. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, because the other thing is, Sophie, that throughout all this time, I always tried to live what they put on you, this normal life. So despite everything that I was told, I went out and I got a job. I worked. I was living my dream, because I wanted to work with aeroplanes, and I had a fantastic career with British Airways that came to a slamming halt when the hospital told them that I had full-blown AIDS. And that was it, gone.
So it's affected all of your life. Now, Theresa May, of course, has announced an inquiry into this disaster. How do you feel about that?
It's a day we've been waiting for many, many years, and like you say, for most of my life. I'm mixed emotions, really, because you see, yes, I'm elated that she's finally called it, but I think it was under pressure that she called it. It wasn't because she wanted to. Then you've got the issue of when you're surrounded by friends and you keep losing your friends and you keep going to more and more funerals, you know that each person that you lose in your life, it's taken a step closer that it could be you next time. Oh, so there's great sadness. And then, of course, you see, I do get quite angry that here we are, 2,500 people plus, haemophiliacs mostly, have died, and nobody really bothered. And what makes it worse is that we're talking about children here. They knowingly injected children with products that could kill them. Even after I was told that I had HIV and then hepatitis C, they just kept on pumping this stuff into us. So each injection I had, which could possibly be every other day, was like playing Russian roulette. You just pulled the trigger and, hey, I dodged a bullet again today. And that's how I've lived my life.
Mark, it's absolutely horrific, and I am so sorry that is how you've had to live your life. I just wish you all the luck in the world for that inquiry and that at least some justice is done. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Let's speak to you once it's all settled down in the future. You're listening to BBC Three Counties Radio.
Across beds, hearts and bucks.
This is Sophie Sulehria.
BBC Three Counties Radio.